So these are some new ideas based on my theory of conceptual spaces. And basically what Matthias and I are working on is to develop new models of reasoning, not logical reasoning, but reasoning with concepts. So in this case, today I will talk about reasoning with generics. So let me say a little bit about the background first here. So in classical logic, philosophers have worked a lot on areas of classical logic, but there are two assumptions that somehow limit the reasoning that you can do in classical logic. One assumption is that inference is seen as a relation between sentences or propositions, so it's a linguistic structure. But I don't think that reasoning about modeling reasoning is only about sentences. It's also about how we think about concepts. And the second argument is that in logic, the only thing you care about is the formal structure of the premises and the conclusion. And it doesn't matter what the different variables mean. And there is no relation to the context and so on. It's just the syntactic formal structure of the argument that is studied. So when we draw a conclusion in classical logic, the agent does not use any semantic knowledge about the premises. And that's a limitation, because a lot of our reasoning depends on our semantic knowledge. And that's what comes to play in particular in generics. I think that Igor will talk about another application of this viewpoint. And that also means that logic is informationally conservative. That is, you don't gain any new knowledge really from logical conclusion. The information is all contained in the premises. You just make certain conclusions explicit by the arguments. So this is a kind of, I shouldn't say criticism, but just to point out the limitations of reasoning in classical logic. And as logicians know, we need to have a lot of meaning postulates. This is a term I borrow from Carnap's work. So you want to say that green is a color and a cat is an animal. You need all these additional postulates or axioms in order to draw reasonable inferences. And very often it's difficult to capture all the meaning postulates that are needed to make an ordinary, everyday argument modeled in logic. So then I go to what I'm doing here with Matthias and to some extent also with Igor. That is to work on reasoning based on expectations. So it's not just things that we take for granted as we do when we take a premise, but expectations are given in everyday reasoning. And when we draw conclusions in everyday life, they are not informationally conservative. We make assumptions. We take what we can call epistemic risks, and we use our background knowledge in productive ways. So we gain new information by doing inferences in our everyday reasoning. And I have an old paper with David Makinson where we analyzed non-monotonic logic as being about expectations. So you have real premises as in classical logic, but then you have expectations that are more or less hidden premises in argument. And we also made a model where we took into account the strength of the expectations. Some expectations are very strong for us, that if I open the door, there will be a floor outside the door and so on. And some expectations are not so strong, that it will be sunshine tomorrow, for instance. So we have different degrees. And this strength of the expectations, that plays a role in the reasoning. In logic, or in non-monotonic logic, people have tried to explain or express them as default assumptions or generics. And these sentences, they're also sentences. They are supposed to be about what is normal or typical. But there are degrees of normality, there are degrees of typicality. So I'm not completely satisfied with this account. And the main idea of this model that Matthias and I have developed is to analyze generics as expectations and not as premises in classical logic. So let's go to generics. What are they? Well, I start by giving some examples. So tigers are striped. French people like wine. Lions have manes. Ducks lay eggs. Ticks carry Borrelia. Sharks kill people. They are some examples of generics that people have studied in the literature. And if we look at the number of instances for each of these generics. So for tigers are striped, that's almost universal. I mean, if an animal does not have stripe, it's most likely not a tiger. It could be some odd mutation, but that's almost. French people like wine. I guess a majority of French people like wine. Lions have manes. That's actually a minority because it's only the adult males that have manes. Females and the pups don't have the cubs, they are called. They don't have manes. Ducks lay eggs. Ducks lay eggs. That's the same thing. It's only the female adults that lay eggs. And among ticks, I think it's about 1% that carry Borrelia, so it's very few. And if we look at sharks kill people, it's extremely few that the sharks that kill people. I mean, it's a couple of individuals a year only. So there is no common rule for how many are needed in order to call a sentence a generic. There are other rules involved in determining whether something is a generic or not. So the old question in philosophy or in linguistics, where people have, and to some extent in psychology, people have tried to understand what people mean by generics. We want to replace that by another question, that is, what is the function of generics in reasoning? So we look at a more pragmatic view. We have a more pragmatic view of generics. It's not just reasoning, but it's the use of generics in more general forms of reasoning. So if we look at the analytic philosophy, meaning of sentences are determined by truth conditions. If we look at the following sentences, birds fly seem to be reasonable, penguins or birds seem to be reasonable, penguins don't fly, we know that, but these three sentences, these three generics taken together, they cannot all be true because they contradict each other. Sorry. So we can't assume that these sentences are universal sentences about birds and penguins and so on. They have to be something else. Otherwise, we get the contradiction if we do classical logic. So philosophers have tried to formulate the interpretation of a generic as typically birds fly. But that doesn't work for all types of generics. I mean, typically sharks kill people is definitely false. If most of the individuals have a certain property, then it could be true. But it's not a general principle. And there are these generic like French like wine cannot be expressed by a universal quantifier, and it cannot be expressed by an existential quantifier either. It's something else. And some people in philosophy have tried to introduce a generics operator, some kind of operator on a sentence. And there are several attempts along these lines, but they have not been successful. I mean, there are always problems with introducing an operator on these generic sentences. So what we do is to take another approach, and that is the expectation approach. We don't assume that generics have truth values. They have a role in reasoning, but they are not sentences that are true or false. So in this sense, we go against the standard view in analytic philosophy. And a generic cannot be evaluated in isolation. It cannot function as on its own. It has to be evaluated together with other background knowledge. So it's just one factor in a system of reasoning. Now, our main thesis is that generics express expectations about the world. Now, the question is, how do we model expectations? That's the main question of our work here. And I already said that these expectations are function with all other types of background knowledge. And they have different strengths. So some expectations are strong, like elephants are gray. It's not a very strong expectations. There are white elephants or very light elephants. There are dark elephants. There may even be pink elephants. So there are some variations. But in general, elephants are gray is a valid generic. Now, elephants have trunks is a stronger generic. We would be more surprised and less willing to accept an animal as an elephant if it didn't have a trunk. So that's a stronger expectations. And if there is a conflict between two expectations, our model says that you should go you should use the stronger expectation in your reasoning. The weaker ones have to let go as premises in an argument. So if you, for instance, have birds fly, penguins are birds, and penguins don't fly, you get the contradiction. And then the weakest of these sentences is that birds fly, because there are quite a number of exceptions to this rule that birds fly. So that sentence has to go when you end up in a conflict. This was basically what David Makerson and I developed in our early paper. So Matthias and I have found that we have actually two types of generics, and you need to keep them separate. And I will talk about each of the types in turn here. So the first type is what we call property generics, and they express sentences like A's have property B, like tigers have stripes, or lions have manes, and so on. And the second type is what we call event generics. And here it's a relation between an individual or a class of individuals and then an event. So ticks cause Borrelia is an example here. Ticks is the category, and the event is to get Borrelia. So we want to make a distinction. They have this slightly different properties, the property generics and event generics. And in the literature, there have been other distinctions proposed, but nobody has done this kind of distinctions. So let's see what it leads to. And also, sharks kill people is an example of an event, a rather rare event, but it's still a causal relation that is involved there. So we have three theses in this model. The first one is, I already said, generics are expectations. The second one is that property generics are used to express relations between concepts. And that's kind of important. Also, when you do inductive reasoning, you end up with relations between concepts. And in other work, I've done some writing on induction as relations between concepts. So it's not a sentential business. It's not the generics are not about sentences. They are about concepts, relations between concepts. So that's a different view than what is now typical of analytic philosophy. And the third thesis is that event generics are about causal relations, relations between concepts and events. So these are our three theses. So there are the two types of generics turn out to have a different ontology, if you like that word. So now I start with property generics, saying that they express relations between concepts. And when you talk about concepts, you can have three kinds of information. It's not very sharp here, but one is a defining information that is more or less true always of it. So a spider's web are made from protein fiber and so on. Things would not be a real spider web unless it was this kind of object. That's a defining property. Then we have characteristic properties. Spiders' webs are used for catching insects. Okay, there could be other uses of spiders' webs and so on. This is a fact of the world, but it's a typical fact of the spider's web. It's a characteristic factor. And then we have what can be called accidental. They are facts about the world, but they are just happen to be facts about the world. That I have lots of spiders' webs in my cellar could be a fact of the world. And sometimes philosophers or linguists talk about lexical knowledge, which would be the defining knowledge, and encyclopedic knowledge, which would be the characteristic knowledge here. So this distinction between lexical and encyclopedic maps onto my distinction here between defining and characteristic properties. And what generics do is they provide characteristic information. I mean, as we said earlier, they talk about what is typical about something. Now, there is a linguist, Lawler, who proposed a test for this kind of generics. So he says that if you have the generic that blue whales eat plankton, this can be seen as a universal sentence, or all blue whales eat plankton. But you can reformulate it to say that a blue whale eats plankton. And that's a bit odd, because a blue whale in traditional logic would be an existential sentence. But here it's not. We're not talking about a single individual. We're talking about a blue whale in general eats plankton. So Lawler's test is that for a generic, you can make this reformulation. While if you have an accidental statement like blue whales can be seen around South Africa, that's an accidental, that's a fact about the world. Then you can't make this reformulation. A blue whale can be seen around South Africa means something different. So this is Lawler's test for when a sentence that looks like an universal is really used as a generic. I will come back to Lawler's test later. But this is kind of useful to see whether some expression really functions as a property generic. Now, okay. So now we get to conceptual spaces and my model of that. I don't know if all of you are familiar with it, so I'll say a few words about how I represent concepts. And they are properties in dimensional domains. I will not have time to talk very much about what I mean by dimensional domains, but here is my classical example, and I guess Igor will also maybe talk about that. The color space. That has 3 dimensions. You have the hue, that is a circular dimension. It has a bright intensity going from gray to more and more intense colors. And then you have brightness going from gray to white or from gray to black. And these 3 dimensions are describe how we as humans perceive similarity between colors. The closer 2 points are in this space, the more similar are the colors. Now, I also assume that properties are convex regions. And this means that if we take the notion of red, that means that if something in this color space is called red, then something else also, some other shade is called red, then anything in between is also called red. That's the definition of convexity. And I proposed in my book on conceptual spaces that natural properties are represented by convex regions in some dimensional domains. I don't have time to go into the details here, but that's the basic idea. And then we also can say that the prototypical properties are those that are central in the region. So we can model prototype effects of concepts using these ideas about convexity and dimensions, dimensional spaces. Now, the modeling here is that generics express more or less prototypical properties. So if you have a bird, it will typically fly, it will build a nest, it will sing, and so on. These are generics that you can form from the prototype of a concept. So that's the role of a generic, to express prototypical properties. So, and then we come to a stronger proposal here, a stronger hypothesis, that the more a concept space that a particular property covers, the stronger is the corresponding generic. And so we can define the degree of validity of a generic as a positive function of the degree of the typicality of the property. So let me illustrate this, these rules by the following example. So we have, I make a toy example here. We have the elephant space. This is a region of a multidimensional animal space, but let's assume we have it in two-dimensional. And here is the prototypical elephant. It's gray, it has a trunk, it has 4 legs, it can do things with its trunk and whatnot. I mean, it's a prototypical thing here. And most of the elephants have trunks. So I draw this circle here. There are a few elephants down here in the elephant space that don't have trunks, but there are probably very few. So having a trunk, this property covers almost everything of the elephant region. So that's a strong generic. But if you look at elephants are gray, there are few. This is a toy example, but there are a number of white and black elephants that are outside this domain, but still the prototype is gray. And now, in order to evaluate the strength of the generic that elephants are gray and the elephants have trunks, you can take a simple mathematical rule, simply looking at what is the distance to the closest non-example of the prototype of the property. So this is the closest non-gray individual, and that we measure with D1. And this is the closest elephant that does not have a trunk, and that we measure with DT2. And these distances map the strength is one way of measuring the strength of a generic. There are probably other ways, but we went for this rather simplistic way of measuring strength. And so that means that since D2 is longer than D1, the generic that elephants have trunk is stronger than the generic that elephants have gray. This is a very simple model, can be developed, can be modified, but as a first approximation, we think of this as a way of measuring the strength of a generic or the degree of validity of a generic. So this is basically our model of how generics work. And they generate non-monotonic reasoning. So if you first learn that something is a bird, I mean, you assume, your expectation is that it is a prototypical bird, and you will assume that it will fly. So that's if you only have the information that a particular individual X is a bird, that will be your expectation. So then if you then learn that X is a penguin, now you have to shift your knowledge, you have to add something. You move out of the prototypical area of birds, and you move out in I shouldn't say the corner, but at the outskirts of the bird region, where birds typically don't fly, because that's a prototypical property of penguins. And if you know the work by the philosopher Paul Grice, he says that you should be maximally informative if you have if you know that something is a penguin, you should say that. You shouldn't say that X is a bird, because if you say that X is a bird, then the one you're communicating with will assume that X flies and so on. But if you know it's a penguin, you should say that, because then your listener will not assume that it can fly and so on. So this is a version of the Gricean principle to be maximally communicative. And I think this is how we use generics in general. When we have a choice between a less precise generic and a more precise that covers more of the background information, we should use the more precise one. And now we can take an example how you can reason with generics as background information. So let's take the example that I mentioned earlier. Ducks lay eggs. Well, they don't. I mean, most ducks don't lay eggs. Male ducks, young duck, chicken, whatever they're called, don't lay eggs. It's only the adult females. But we still accept this. Why? Because we have as a background information that birds are sexually reproducing. They're not like amoebas. They don't divide. They reproduce sexually. And ducks are birds. Well, that's also common knowledge. And we know that birds are in birds only adult females reproduce. This is a background knowledge. And all these expectations are stronger than this one. But if you take actually classical logic, this sentence, given these sentences as background, ducks lay eggs will be equivalent to adult female ducks lay eggs. So ducks lay eggs, given the background information, gives exactly the same information as this sentence. So then Grayson principles, again, now this is a question of being economic in your communication. Since you assume that the people you're talking with know these facts, then it's easier to say that ducks lay eggs than to say that adult female ducks lay eggs, because people will still interpret you as saying that adult female ducks lay eggs. So this is an explanation of why we see the generalizations like this, although they are not fulfilled by a majority of the individuals, because given the background information, we know that it covers a more precise, and of course not all adult female ducks lay eggs. Some of them have, they may not be able to lay eggs, but majority, a big number, and that's enough for us to say that adult female ducks typically lay eggs. Okay, so that's an example of how background information is important in your how you reason with generics. That's what I wanted to say about property generics. And now I come to the second type of generics, event generics. And here we don't really have a well-developed formal model, because it depends on causal relation, and modeling causal relations is not easy, as some of you may know. Sorry, oops. So we already saw these sentences that ticks carry Borrelia and sharks kill people, and now it's a combination of a noun. I mean, this category ticks, and then a verb phrase. It's carry Borrelia. So the important part here in an event generic is actually the verb. Verb connected with another noun here, but it's the verb phrase that is the causal event here. In property generics, it's a connection between two noun phrases, and then there is just a generic is or are in between the verb in between the nouns. But here it's a verb that somehow describes events. So that's a kind of syntactic or linguistic difference between property generics and event generics. And another interesting observation is that event generics do not pass Lawlor's test. Lawlor's test only applies to property generics. So we can actually use this test to make a distinction between property generics and event generics. So this sentence, ticks carry Borrelia, does not express the same as a tick carries Borrelia. That has a different meaning. And sharks kill people is not the same, doesn't have the same meaning as a shark kills people. So event generics don't pass this test, and that's I think a good reason for distinguishing these two types of generics. And then you have some little bit odd cases. Bulgarians are good weightlifters. This looks like it's a property generic because there is an R here. There is no verb involved. But we cannot use, this doesn't pass Lawlor's test either. Bulgarians are good weightlifters doesn't mean the same thing as a Bulgarian is a good weightlifter. So this is an evidence that this somehow is not the property generic. And some linguist, I've forgotten the name, has proposed that this should be rewritten, has the same meaning in that as that in events of good weightlifting, Bulgarians are often involved. So it's a little bit odd, but I think there are good reasons for viewing generics like this as an event generic. That may lead to discussions, but I leave it for now. And then then our general analysis here is that N is a causal factor for V. Doesn't mean that the noun is a very strong factor, but still that it's a relevant, sufficiently strong causal factor for the event to occur. So in the case of sharks kill people, it's in events of killing people, sharks are sometimes involved. It's a causal factor for the death of people. And that's why we accept such an improbable event as a shark killing people, because sometimes there are still the sharks are still causal factors in these events. Yeah. So now it doesn't assume high probability at all, and that's a difference from most analysis of generics that have been found that can be found in the literature. And again, there are weaker and stronger factors. I mean, there are weaker and stronger causal links. If we take ticks carry Borrelia, it's a very strong link, because I don't think that there are other, I don't know actually, but I don't think there are other insects that carry, or other animals that carry Borrelia. So in this case, it's a very strong causal factor for getting Borrelia. Sharks kill people is a much weaker one, because there are many causal factors of animals killing people, or other events of people becoming dead. So that's a weaker generic. And also Bulgarians are good weightlifters. Yeah, some Bulgarians are, and there might be other causal factors. I mean, like training or having a particular body constitution, and other factors that are much stronger causal factors for becoming a good weightlifter. So we don't, we also for event generics, we can make this distinction between strong and weak. Now, exactly how to model that in a more mathematical way, you need to have a model. For doing that, you need to have a model of events and factors are involved in the events. I have some ideas on how to do it, but we haven't developed it yet. So far, where there is no formal model for how to handle the event generics. We have a model for the property generics, but not quite as good a model for the event generics. But that's something to work on. Now, so this was all I wanted to say about the event generics. Now, I get back to why do we have generics in language? What kind of function do they have? This was my original question. So let's go to the pragmatics of generics. When do we utter generics? What are they used for? So if we look at how children learn to use generics, it turns out they use generic sentences like cats say meow and milk is good to drink and so on. They use these sentences earlier in their development than they use sentences with quantifiers like all and some. So somehow generics are more natural to children than quantificational sentences. And that may be a problem for some logicians, but that's how the world is. That's how children learn language. They learn generics quite early, actually. And already 2.5-year-olds use generics, like the cat says meow and things like that. And if you look at how we interact with children when they are about 2-3 years old, we often sit with them in these children's books with animals, where you point and you say that the cat says meow and the cow says moo and the dog says bow wow and so on. We have these picture books where we express generic sentences about the animals that we see in the book. So that's a typical use of generics in parent-child interaction. And actually, if you look at 4-year-olds, they use generics quite a lot. And some psychologists have estimated that as much as 4% of the statements of 4-year-olds are generics. And to me, this is a very surprisingly high figure. So, a hypothesis that I want to put forward here. I mean, I haven't really worked it out in detail, but this the generics are part of natural pedagogy. We use them to convey information about the world, what is typical of different types of individuals in the world. It's typical of tigers that they have stripes. It's typical of cows that I say moo, and so on. And I also inform about causal effects. Very often they come with warnings. Tigers are dangerous. I mean, means that tigers kill people or sharks kill people. They mean that you should learn about some causal effects that are important for you. And of course, not being killed is of utmost importance. So we have the event generics to express all kinds of causal effects. Or you can also have practical things that if you want to eat the meat, you need to cook it first. This plant is dangerous. You need to, or poisonous. You need to have a lot of information about causal properties of various types of objects. So the role of generics as natural pedagogy is to provide general knowledge about the world. And that's why we have generics in our language. It's not to state facts, but it's to give you expectations about the world. Now, I said that expectations are stronger and weaker. And one question I can't give an explanation to is, how do children learn about the strength of generics? I mean, they learn that tigers are striped, and they learn that tigers have 4 legs and so on. How do they know which is or they learn that elephants are gray and elephants have trunks. How do they learn which is the stronger of these generics? I don't really know, but I have a speculation, and that is that Gricean principles are involved. When an adult or any person expresses a generic, they apply the Gricean principles, and they are maximally informative. So when they talk about birds, they may say that birds fly, but if they talk about the penguin, they obviously have to say that penguins don't fly, because that's unexpected if you know that the penguin is a bird. So I think that one possible way to explain how children learn about the strength of generics, that's important for how we've written with them, is that people in general, when they communicate with generics, apply the standard Gricean principles of communication. So I'm finished. What I've done is to give you present two types of generics, the property generics and event generics. For property generics, we have a model that can be tested. For event generics, we don't really have it yet. And then I said something at the end about what is the function of generics? Why are generics so frequent in our language? So thank you very much for your attention.